Everybody, welcome to Tough Questions to Improve Your Leadership. My name is Richard Atlas, and I'm one of the co-founders of Clever Endeavour Games. We're a small studio from Montreal of 6 people. We make a game called Ultimate Chicken Horse. And so our studio consists of 2 programmers, 2 artists, a community manager, and myself. So today, in 30 minutes, I'm going to try to convince every single one of you that you can become a better leader. I'm going to try to convince you of that, and I'm going to try to give you the tools and the motivation, more importantly the motivation, to do so. So the goal here is to inspire you to think about your own situation and ways in which you can improve. I'm not going to stand here and tell you what you should do, because I don't think I or anyone else has the knowledge or the right to tell you that. But I'm going to try and poke at certain things that maybe you haven't thought of, and hopefully you can reflect on that and improve for yourself. So we might be decent leaders, good ones, or even great ones, but I think that we can be better. And there's 3 ways that I'm going to try and do this today with you guys. So by admitting our flaws, by talking to other people in our situation, and by thinking critically about our practices, we can become better leaders for ourselves and for our organizations. Hopefully that's why you're all here today. So the best game development companies, and the best companies in general are made up of the people who are the best at their craft. So the slides aren't showing? Ooh. This one? We good? Yep, that looks about right. OK, so I'm going to go back. Admitting our flaws. What's that little box there? OK. Admitting our flaws, talking to others in our situation, and thinking critically about our practices. Those were the things that I just said. So the best game development companies and the best companies in general are made up of the people who are the best at their craft. So the best artists make the best art, the best combat designers design the best combat, and the best programmers write the best code. Now, I'm none of those people, and you might not be any of those people either. My role involves asking myself the tough questions that I'm about to ask and help make my organization better in the process. So regardless of your roles on the team, your craft as a leader needs to be creating and maintaining the morale and the motivation of the people on your team. And by working to become the best you can possibly be at this, you give your company and your team the best chance at success. So today, we're going to talk about roles and relationships, interpersonal communication, information transfer, structure, planning, and efficiency. We're going to talk to each other about the problems that we faced and try to come up with solutions to those problems. And you've probably noticed the handout that I've given you. I realized I did not print enough of them and did not realize how big this room was. But if not, hopefully you can follow along with someone who's next to you who has this. And the idea is that on this handout, you can jot down some ideas as the questions go along in this talk. And so all those questions you'll see on the sheet. And at the end, there's a bunch of questions that I did not have time to stick into the presentation that I would like you to look at as well. So my goal is that everybody in this room leaves with different notes, as I said before, and notes that pertain to their situation and the places where they can improve. Thinking about these notes after this talk, and likely after GDC, might be the most important part of this talk. So hopefully I can inspire you to do that. So let's start with a question. First, I'm going to ask everybody to stand up, please. Can everybody please stand up? Thank you. So are you your own worst boss? Sit down if you think that if you were your own employee, you would quit based on the hours asked of you, the work on weekends, the stress imposed on you by yourself. OK, not too many. Now, sit down if you think that you could realistically manage your time significantly better than you do. OK, a few more. Now, sit down if you think you could manage your tasks, which tasks you're being assigned, and how you're prioritizing them better. Now we're getting most of you. And finally, this one might take an extra second. Sit down if you treat your employees better than you treat yourself. All right, so for the people still standing, please hire everybody else around you. No, I'm kidding. Thank you for that exercise. So this example, this question of are you your own worst boss, comes from a blog post by the amazing Seth Godin. And it made me think about how much I can learn about management by looking at how I manage myself. And the question is, how can you expect to be a good leader for others if you can't be good for yourself? I'm not singling out people who sat down, although I guess it was most of you, and myself included. But we all have examples of this, and we can all do better. According to Mr. Godin, there are a few good books on being a good manager, fewer still on managing yourself. And it's hard to think of a more essential thing to learn. Let's jump into another question. How do you let your team know that you're listening to them? How do you let your team know that you care about them as human beings as well as professionals? How do you know how they're feeling about the work that they're doing, their compensation, their relationship with other members of the team? Do they have the space to be open with you about these kind of things, either professional problems or personal problems? Can you think of a time when maybe there was an issue between you and your colleagues or an employer and an employee because there was a lack of this space to communicate? So I'm actually going to ask you to talk about this for a second, and we're going to do a little interactive session. So I'm going to ask you to break into groups of 3 to 4 people. Just turn around to the people next to you and behind you. You don't need to move much. And what I'm going to do is, after a couple minutes, I'm going to ask these groups to give me a one-sentence idea, a single-sentence idea of how we can make our employees feel more appreciated and heard and empowered. So I'll give an example from Clever Endeavour Games, just to get the ball rolling. So one of the things that I try to do is one-on-one meetings with everyone on the team, co-founders, employees, everybody. And I ask them how they're feeling about their work, how their health is going, how they're sleeping, and if there's anything I can do to remove roadblocks. So my one-sentence idea would be one-on-one meetings every few months. So I'm going to ask you guys to get to it. And I think there's a timer that might be able to exist there, maybe? All right, 2 minutes, please go. Alrighty, ding, 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 ding. Everybody, please wrap it up. I didn't bring a bell. I was supposed to bring a bell that I was going to ring and go ding, 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 but I didn't, so I'm just going to have to be the bell myself. Alrighty, folks. So I'm going to ask a couple of groups just at random. Someone wants to raise their hand. I'll ask them to just yell out their one-sentence idea that they discussed in their little group, and then I'll repeat it back on the mic. So we have any volunteers?
A company survey every 6 months.
Company survey every 6 months. And that is asking people about how things are going, like everybody in the company?
Yeah.
Great.
I try to do something with any piece of feedback I solicit.
OK, so actually using feedback. Do we have another one? I can't really see you guys, so sorry.
After being accused of always being in a meeting, I impose on myself to actually show up once in a while and discuss just casually with the team.
Great. One last one on this side.
Maybe daily reviews or weekend of sprint reviews to let people stand up and show that the work that they've done and talk about what hasn't gone well or what has gone well, and then other people can sort of take note of that and help them sort of solve those problems.
Awesome. So daily reviews where people can showcase their work. Great. Good stuff. We're going to hop into another question because time is short. But thank you all for that participation. So how much cognitive diversity does your team have? So cognitive diversity is the measure of how different the approaches of problem-solving styles are of the members of your team. So for example, a new feature is proposed to a team. One person might be hesitant about technical challenges and want to do some research. Another person might jump in and be like, let's build it right now. The other person might say, well, that's going to be really expensive. Have we considered how much that's going to cost over the long run, et cetera? There's an article published by the Harvard Business Review, and they found evidence that a team that is not cognitively diverse was shown to perform worse in problem-solving tasks because it was homogeneous in how it decided to think about change. And despite this team being mixed in terms of age, gender, and ethnicity, they weren't able to do this problem-solving task as well. And this is something that's harder to see than ethnic or gender diversity, but is shown in their studies to be critical to success as well. So a good exercise to think about cognitive diversity is this 6 thinking caps exercise that maybe you might have seen. The idea is that a different thinking cap has a different sort of personality, and people can put on those thinking caps and bring to the discussion the personality or the point of view of that thinking cap. So the first one, the white cap, is facts. It's just the information that's needed in the discussion. The yellow hat is optimism, so it talks about what kind of positive benefits this new feature or this discussion could have. The black hat is caution, so it's kind of the devil's advocate of what could go wrong. The red hat talks about feelings, so they're open to share if they love or hate the idea and give their hunches or intuition. The green hat is creativity, so they talk about new possibilities and alternatives. And the blue hat is process. So the blue hat is the person who keeps the thing on track and makes sure everybody is speaking according to their role. By the way, these hats are taken from a game called King of the Hat, which is made by another Montreal team, and they're fantastic. So check out King of the Hat. All right, next question. How much psychological safety does your team have? So psychological safety is the feeling that you won't be punished when you make a mistake and that you can be free to speak your mind. So Google conducted a large-scale 2-year study that looked at what made for the most successful creative teams. And psychological safety was one of the 5 key elements that they landed on. And so I'm going to ask you to do something for me. You might notice throughout this talk I'm doing lots of little interactive stuff, so bear with me. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a second. And I can't see any of your eyes, so I can't prove that you're doing it, but please close your eyes. And think about the last design discussion or important team meeting that you may have had. Try to picture what the room looked like, who was in there, what kind of chair you're sitting on, just to get an idea of what you're seeing. Now, think about how aware you were of the dynamic in that room. Could there have been someone holding back from saying something because they felt it wasn't their role, perhaps? Imagine the new design intern who's surrounded by senior designers, and they come up with what they think is a stupid idea. How do you think they would feel trying to share that idea? This psychological safety is not an easy thing to create. You can open your eyes now in case they were closed. The psychological safety is not an easy thing to create. It's rooted in your company culture, in the way you carry yourself as a leader, and in every relationship between every person in the room at all times. I don't think there's any secret sauce to this, and I wouldn't claim to know it if there was. But as I mentioned before in the one-on-ones, and as we heard from a few people who gave feedback, there are things you can try to do to make your employees feel more empowered and make your workplace more psychologically safe. Now, on the topic of cognitive diversity that we just talked about and psychological safety, there was another Harvard Business Review a study which combines these ideas of cognitive diversity and psychological safety. So you'll see this little chart here that is currently empty. You actually have one on your handout as well. So in the bottom left quadrant of this chart, we have an area of low cognitive diversity and low psychological safety. So teams don't feel super safe to express themselves, or members of the team, and there isn't a lot of diversity of thought. These people, these groups tend to be defensive or conforming. In the top left quadrant, we have high diversity of thought, but low psychological safety. So people have very different ways of approaching problems, but aren't necessarily comfortable sharing those. So this can lead teams to be oppositional or too cautious or resistant. In the bottom right quadrant, we have a team that's easy to express itself, but somewhat homogeneous in the way that it solves problems. So these kind of teams might end up being very uniform. Now the goal, at least according to this study, is to end up in this top right quadrant, which is high psychological safety and high cognitive diversity. So this kind of atmosphere makes for generative, curious, and experimental teams. Now, the question to you, I'm going to take away the good ones so you don't associate with them. The question to you is to think about some of these adjectives and think about where your team might lie on this chart in terms of cognitive diversity and psychological safety. If you're using the handout, you can feel free to just put an X there and think about that later. Otherwise, you can just kind of mentally note down some of these adjectives and think of maybe a time when your team performed as one of these adjectives describes in a negative way. So the truth of the matter is that you already have some degree of cognitive diversity on your team, but are you making the most of the cognitive diversity you have? You also likely have some psychological safety, and you might be well on your way to becoming a team that exists in that top right quadrant that we just saw. By encouraging people to solve problems in different ways, by welcoming new approaches to how we take in and process information, and by being open to responding in new ways to problems, we can encourage this cognitive diversity and create a psychologically safe environment. Now, a large part of this responsibility lies on you, the leader, to think critically about these issues and to promote a culture, an environment in which this diversity and this safety can thrive. And in fact, we've already thought of some ways we can do that in the interactive talk that we did. So we're about halfway through, and where have we gotten so far? So far today, we've admitted our flaws, as we saw with the standing and sitting exercise. We've talked to others in our situation, as we saw with the little group discussions. and we've thought critically about our practices, as we saw with the cognitive diversity and psychological safety. So now I'm going to throw more questions at you. And the rest of the talk is made up of these questions that can be approached with these 3 tools in mind: admitting our flaws, discussion with others, and critical thought. Now, these questions are about you, about your organization, and about how you can help improve your organization. I opted not to categorize them because they're all interrelated and they involve all sorts of things: ego, confidence, trust, social awareness, blame, all sorts of things. And there's no right answer to any of these questions, but hopefully I can inspire you to think about the answers yourself. So the first question, are you the rock? Not Dwayne Johnson, although that would be awesome. But are you that static, immovable force that doesn't sway in the face of opposition? So imagine the CEO that comes into the meeting with a big smile, and the day after the game launched with crappy reviews, and speaks calmly and says, we're going to bounce back from this, and even though we didn't get funding for our next project, it's okay, and even though the money's tight, everything's going to be okay. And now, on the opposite side, imagine the CEO who comes in, big bags under their eyes, they've just been up all night answering angry reviews or bad reviews, and they've been preparing a pitch for the next project because they need to have it ready for 8 a.m. tomorrow, and they slump down in their chair and they say, all right, let's talk about the game. So maybe there's something in between these 2 things, though. So the great professor of social work and researcher, Brené Brown, if you haven't heard of her, please check her out. She's fantastic. Talks about vulnerability as being a key factor in being a good leader. So according to her, vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And a good leader walks into these with confidence. So imagine that same CEO walking into the room and saying, look, folks, we know that the game got bad reviews, and it stresses me out too. But let's look at why that was. Let's see what we can do better on our next project. And money is going to be tight because our next game wasn't funded yet. But if we can be more communicative when our deadlines are starting to slip, we can get through this together. There's nothing shameful about coming into a meeting and admitting that you don't know the answer to a problem. So maybe being vulnerable doesn't mean being an emotional mess, and maybe you don't need to be the rock. Maybe you do. I'll leave that to you to ponder. Do you fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy? So the sunk cost fallacy is the idea that people continue with a behavior or project because of an emotional or a financial investment they've made in it. And this is related to loss aversion, the idea that people are more likely to avoid loss than they are to seek gain. And to me, this is one of the most dangerous things in game development. And it's one of the things I see absolutely all over the place. People will work 8 months on a project, and it's not quite where it needs to be. And then they'll say, well, it's only another 8 months of development, and we're already halfway through, so we might as well stick it out and continue this. And then it's game development, so 16, 24 months later, the game comes out, and it fails. And nobody's even surprised. The team that made it is like, well, it was doomed to fail 8 months through. And they should have killed it earlier. But because of this sunk cost fallacy, they thought they had already put so much into it that they couldn't do that. Next question. Do you do things based on your role and not your knowledge or expertise? So a personal example here, I've made calls about project management, about scheduling, and when our game actually launched, I kind of decided when the game was going to launch without having the right information about the fact that there were features that were behind where they needed to be, and I caused a ton of stress on the team. Now, I did this because I thought it was my role and that was my job, but I didn't have the information that I needed. Do you ignore statistics because you think you're different? So David Dunning of the Dunning-Kruger effect, that you might know, has shown in studies that, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but basically everyone thinks they're better than they are, always. Now, especially in the case of project planning, this is something that is a serious flaw. So I'm going to give you a fake example, because I don't know anything about making MMOs. But most MMOs, let's say, would take 4 years to make. But our team's going to be able to do it in 2, because those other teams had to switch game engines halfway through development, and we're happy with our game engine. And they had 2 senior programmers leave 6 months before launch, but our team's happy. We do one-on-ones. Everybody seems happy, right? So this is dangerous, as you might be able to tell. Here's another question. Do you reward extroversion over introversion? So raise your hand if you consider yourself an extrovert. OK, now, Raise your hand. You keep your hand up, please. Raise your hand if you think that you're more extroverted than the average person on your team. All right, looks like we have a lot of introverts. So, and most of you lead teams, and you realize that even as a team leader, who one might think would typically be extroverted, there are a ton of introverts. And the power of introversion, or the power of creativity in introversion, is something that should not be squashed down in favor of extroversion. Now, there's a great TED Talk by Susan Cain about the power of introversion in creativity. She gives some examples that some introverts that are some of the most creative minds in history. And I wanted to give you an example of a case in game development where maybe we'll reward extroversion over introversion, not even consciously. So brainstorm meetings are a great example of this. They're an easy time for an extrovert and a terrible time for an introvert. According to Cain, groups famously follow the opinions of the most dominant or charismatic person in the room, even though there's zero correlation between the best talker and having the best ideas. This is something you probably know, but this is also something that you might not realize in a meeting setting, that maybe the louder voice is being heard more. So at Clever Endeavour, one of the things we try to do is we try to come up with solutions separately before we come to a design discussion or a meeting about something. So a problem will come up, and then we will go off on our own, write things down, and then we'll bring up that list when we actually come to talk about it. It's not a perfect solution, but we try to counteract that somewhat natural tendency. So what works for companies around you? Take project management, for example. What are other teams doing successfully? Now, I was actually going to ask you to swap sheets with the person next to you. I realize not everybody has a sheet. So give your sheet to someone who is not you, and write down, I'm going to ask you to write down a one-sentence idea of something in project management that your team does that you find useful. So it can be anything, a tip, a trick, or a quirk, or anything. Just something that you find interesting. So if you guys can do that, write on someone else's paper something, and then they will be able to bring that home. I'll give you about 50 seconds. Go. Or you can just tell it to the person next to you. That works too. Alrighty. Ding, 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 ding. Should really get an actual bell next time. Everybody, please pay attention. Hello. This is not working. There you go. Thank you. Appreciate that. Alrighty. So, next question. Do you fill the space in meetings? And if you didn't, who would? So I'm not great at this. I will often ask a question, and there's this awkward silence. And I fill that silence. And I sometimes, often, will answer the question that I've asked with my own opinion. The goal is not to try to convince everybody to think like me. It's simply to fill the space. But what I notice is that when I stop doing that, when I actively stop doing that, someone else fills the space, obviously. And it might be someone who doesn't often speak up in meetings or in discussions. This can be a very powerful thing to try, especially if you, like myself, have found yourself filling the space when there's some empty space. Lastly, where do you want to be in 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years? Does everybody on the team know where you want to be personally? Do you know where everybody else on the team wants to be in their professional development, personally, either with your studio or not? So I'm going to ask you, if you're using the handout, to write down the name of 3 people that you work with. It doesn't have to be the closest people to you, just any 3 people. If you're not using the handout, just try to think mentally of 3 people that you work with. Get those in your head. I know the 3. They're right there. So think about one of those names, pick one of those names at random, and think about where that person wants to be in 2 years. Do you know where they want to be, what they want to be doing, what their ideal job or job title is? This is something that can be quite important because it can help to steer where your company is going and how you interact with that person, how you treat them, the kind of tasks you might assign to them if you're assigning tasks, or the kind of work you might share with them. Now I can tell you where I'd like to be in that time. I'd like to be doing creative and fun work in a studio that has a great culture that I've helped to nourish and to cultivate. By being aware that I can improve, and from critical analysis, and from talking to the people around me, I, like everybody else in this room, can become a better leader. And hey, if there's any place in the world to do that, it's right here and now at GDC, surrounded by all these creative minds. So I'm going to leave you with a call to action. Please take some time to consider what was talked about today, and keep striving to be more than just the status quo. Be the best at your craft, and be the best leader that you can possibly be. Your organization can and will be cognitively diverse, psychologically safe, creative, innovative, and successful. It's just up to you to make that happen. Thank you.